Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's 811 PRA webinar on environmental tenants. Before we get started, I just have a few webinar reminders. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing later. We will take questions today, but it will be at the end of the presentation. But you're welcome to submit your questions throughout the presentation by using the questions box that you see on the slide that's on your screen now. All attendees are currently muted, but if you would like to speak during the Q&A, please be sure to enter your audio PIN and also use that raise your hand function that's showing on the slide. And you can enter your audio PIN by pressing pound, your audio PIN number, and pound on your phone's keypad. Joining us today from HUD are PRA staff, Marvis Hayward and Katina Washington, and environmental staff, Hillary Atkin and Stefan Tomatos. And from TAC, you have Stacy Fox and Lisa Sloan. Now I'm going to turn things over to Marvis and Katina, who's going to review today's agenda for you. Marvis, Katina?
Hi, thank you, Stacy. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Hopefully you'll get some great information about the environmental reviews. We're pleased to have with us today Hillary Atkin and Stefan Tomatos to discuss the PRA program environmental requirements. Hillary, she's been grateful and gracious enough to join us and to do this environmental webinar, even though she has moved on to another position in HUD. And Stefan Tomatos will be acting in her position as of right now. So if you have any questions, you can email us and we'll forward them over to Stefan. If you take a look at today's agenda, we're going to go over the basics of the environmental review, some clarifications, the documentations. We're also going to review the tenants as well as resources. And of course, at the end of every webinar, if you have any questions, please enter them into the question box and Lisa and Stacy will facilitate the answers. Now I'm going to hand it over to Hillary, who's going to begin her presentation.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all doing well today. Thanks for joining us. As we go along, as they said, please save your questions. We're going to get to those at various points throughout. But we, of course, want to hear what you have to say. And anything we don't get to today, we'll make sure to follow up with you later. So we're going to kick this off with just some basic things that I think are important to keep in mind for this program. It is a little unique as compared to some of other HUD's programs and how they do environmental review. One is that the requirements for these reviews are created as part of the NOFA for the program to ensure that the tenets of HUD's environmental policies and requirements are met. So what this means is that the guidance and the requirements that you're going to be looking at are those NOFA requirements, and not the usual regulations and policies and laws that you may look to for other programs. Also, HUD is not performing the environmental reviews for these projects, and for that matter, neither are responsible entities. So that's going to inform how you may look at complying with these tenets. And along that line, the entity that will be conducting the reviews are the grantees, which is discussed in the NOFA. Okay, next slide, please. And one thing I did want to mention with the last slide, sorry for asking you to go to the next slide, is that the reason it's set up like this is because HUD is not making site-specific decisions. So there's no review by HUD at that point or by an RE. And we set this up in this manner because when HUD does a policy or a project, we would look at a review, an environmental review. Here, since we're not doing any project level decision making, the point at which we had to determine how to make sure there were no environmental impacts for this program was at the policy level. So putting forth these tenets, we're done for that purpose. And that might be a little bit confusing. If you have questions, please feel free to ask, but I wanted to give you guys that background in case that will help explain why these tenets are in place and are a little bit different than what you're used to. Okay. So clarifications. First, you'll notice throughout the tenets that there's reference to new construction or existing. New construction is self-explanatory for the most part. Something that's coming up, it's an entirely new structure that includes structures that may be the result of demolition activities, and existing means everything else. One thing to keep in mind for existing properties is that they may meet an exception, which we'll also discuss a little bit later, from having to do any of the environmental tenets at all. And that exception is basically that it's an existing property that has no physical activities going on, so nothing beyond routine maintenance or minimal repairs, and is something that's already HUD assisted. Okay, next slide, please. So continuing with some clarifications. Along the lines of this kind of existing new analysis is also whether the project has work going on that has proceeded to the point where it's not feasible that an activity could take place that could be modified to address environmental impact. So if you've got a project that's already in progress with new construction or rehab work going on, see if the work is still at a point where it could be modified. If it is, you need to comply with the requirements that are set forth in the tenets. If not, then you may not, depending on whether it's an existing site. There's still a point where you can do the existing requirements. You could do those, and that language is in the NOFA also. Next slide, please. And then this is the exception I was alluding to earlier. So as explained, it has to do with one, the first part of the analysis is whether it's HUD assisted, currently a HUD assisted. And then the second part of the analysis is whether the project is engaging in activities that have physical impacts beyond maintenance or minimal repair type stuff. So this slide provides you with what could be considered HUD assistance, but for the most part that term is pretty self-explanatory. Okay, next slide, please. So a little bit more fleshing out of what I was talking about earlier, that the environmental reviews for the PRA program are not under Part 50 or Part 50. They're just under the NOFA and are described in the PRA guidelines. I think they're also put forth in the RAC that you all sign. So it's important to keep that in mind when thinking about compliance. The other thing that's important to think about is that HUD's involvement is at the very beginning, at the very end, right? So we select grantees, and grantees kind of carry out what's going on with the environmental reviews for the program. But at the end, HUD may do some monitoring. So the reason we set up these requirements was that we would be able to look to see if they had been met in the event of monitoring. Besides the making sure that there's a minimal environmental impact, as I talked about at the beginning of this webinar. So that's also important to keep in mind. As far as timing, we haven't gotten too many timing questions thus far from people, but wanted to put out there that we would be expecting completion of environmental review prior to signing the rental assistance contract. That has to do with timing of signatures and just what makes sense with the program. So wanted to get that out there in case people had any questions. And then also one of the questions we have gotten a few times has to do with utilizing existing environmental reviews. That is, of course, entirely possible. That's kind of entirely possible with any environmental review. It just depends on whether the reviews you're attempting to utilize and information in those reviews are still timely. So, for an example, Phase 1, does it still meet the timing requirements that are within the Phase 1 ESA standard, at ASTM standard? Or, any other authority, does that information that you have from a previous review still apply to this site? Have floodplain maps changed? And so on and so forth. So it's possible to utilize environmental reviews as long as they still make sense to use. Next slide, please. Okay, so documentation. We got a lot of questions on how to document the reviews, what formats to use, that kind of stuff. There is no form that's required for this PRA program. That, of course, has lots of guidance on how to do reviews. They have forms that are required for other programs or suggested formats for still other programs, but nothing specifically for PRA. So what I would say is, keep in mind that the NOFA PRA guidelines tell you what requirements apply and when. But you can use these other HUD guidances, formats, and forms to figure out how to satisfy those requirements. So for documentation specifically, what we'd be looking for, in the event of a monitoring, or if you had questions about how to document, are clear explanations of how you've satisfied the requirements and references to any documentation or reports or whatever you have to back those explanations up. So that may be the HUD forms and formats that you look to, although you have to keep in mind that it does not meet the PRA tenets, does not follow them exactly. Another way to document that you satisfied the requirements could be a cover page for each tenant and where you explain your conclusions and then attach the supporting documentation. In addition, we have gotten hold of a few formats that people have been using for this program, grantees have put together, and we're taking a look at that to see if we have any suggestions on how to make that better. Once that's done, that may also be very helpful. Okay, so the first tenet, getting into the meat of things. Site contamination. Now this is probably the, I don't want to say most confusing, but has the most interesting things going on. So we're going to take this nice and slow, go through the different options that are available, the different clarifications and exceptions and whatnot that have come out since the first NOFA was published, and this might be a good one for you to hang on to questions about. Okay, so the tenant on-site contamination applies to both new construction and existing properties. We have two options available for people to meet the site contamination requirement. The first is condition assessment option, and the second is the phase 1 ESA option. So first we're going to talk about that condition assessment option. Next slide, please. So what we would be looking for if this is the option that you decide you want to take to satisfy this requirement is assessing whether any of these 4 conditions or issues are present on the site. Is it listed as a Superfund site? Is it located with 3,000 feet of a toxic or solid waste landfill site? Are there any underground storage tanks other than residential fuel tanks at the site? And is it known or suspected to be contaminated by toxic chemicals or radioactive chemicals? Or, I'm sorry, radioactive materials. If any of these conditions are present, you would actually be required to order a phase 1 ESA. Next slide, please. Now, if none of these conditions exist, what you would do is document that in the file for the site and maintain that in the file for potential future monitoring by HUD. So you'd go through, you would explain that none of those conditions are met. You'd back that up with the documentation and research that you had to get to that point and keep it in the file. And as I said, if any of the conditions exist, then you would work to provide an ASTM phase 1 environmental site assessment. Okay, so that's the first option. Well, let's say you take the second option, which is to put a phase 1 ESA together without looking to see if any of the conditions are present. If you're doing that, what you're going to simply do is ensure that that phase 1 ESA meets the currently applicable ASTM standard, which is the 13 version. Give a few links here of where you can purchase that standard if you haven't already done so. And you'll notice within that standard that a vapor encroachment screen is required as part of that standard. A HUD for this program and for most of our programs in housing, traditionally it requires that that screen is done through the ASTM E2600 standard. So I also included that link here. A few important things to keep in mind if you have a Phase 1 ESA report is that we need to be seeing definitive conclusions as to whether there are recognized environmental conditions or vapor encroachment conditions. Another thing to keep in mind is timing. There are continuing viability requirements within the ASTM Phase 1 ESA standard. They have to do with the report being prepared within a year of a real estate transaction and updated if older than 180 days. And that's the standards requirements. Now, just to make things a bit more confusing, we've provided some guidance within this program's NOFA about what triggers those time requirements for HUD's purposes. So yes, here we are on our next slide that talks about it a little bit more. So I mentioned that the continuing viability requirements within the ESA standard reference a real estate transaction within a year of a real estate transaction. So what we did with the PRA program is to say that if you have an ESA that was prepared within those timeframes for a real estate transaction, it would be considered to satisfy the program requirement to have a Phase 1 ESA report. I think that is the clearest possible way to say that, but of course if you have questions about it, please ask them. And actually let me see if I can give you an example here. So let's say if you have a site, you've got a building on it, you know, or not. It was acquired 2 years ago, and at the time it was acquired had a Phase 1 ESA report that was compliant with the continuing viability requirements of the ASTM standard. Then that would satisfy that clarification, that requirement that's within the NOFA. Okay, and one other thing I wanted to mention is that this is a program timing requirement for this program specifically. If you're looking to order up a Phase 1 ESA report, trying to meet some sort of liability protections or something under a CERCLA statute, that's a whole other issue, and you're going to need to think about that separately. I just wanted to provide that warning in case this was confusing anyone. Okay, so the next slide, which we are already on, has to do with, once you get past this Phase 1 ESA analysis, if you find out that there is a possibility of contamination on the site through a REC determination, then you would be required to order up a Phase 2 ESA to establish whether, in fact, there is contamination on the site. So the standard that HUD relies on, and is referenced in the NOFA, is ASTM E1903-11. And this slide also discusses a cleanup. So let's say you've got your Phase 2 ESA. It's determined there's contamination on the site. And a cleanup, in that case, a cleanup would be necessary. And it would have to be done in accordance with, your state's policies. A few more helpful links on this page. One that I want to note is that the link that's under resources. That kind of describes a little bit more HUD's different policies on site contamination, in case you want to dive in a little bit more to help you move through this review as you're doing that. Okay, let's do the next slide. So we made it through site contamination. The second tenet has to do with historic preservation. This is much more straightforward. So this requirement, similar to site contamination, also applies to new construction as well as existing. What you're going to do essentially is follow your state, local, territory, tribal, whatever applies to you requirements on historic preservation. So it would not be something where you're following the census isn't under Part 50 or Part 58, the Historic Preservation Act requirements. We also require that any properties that are listed on or eligible for the National Register must comply with the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So the link for those standards is given here, in case you're not familiar with it, and is also given in the NOFA. And also, we've got a nice resources link here if you want to get some more information on general historic preservation analyses through HUD's website. Okay, noise. This requirement only applies to new construction, and essentially it requires attenuation if you've got outside noise above 65 decibels, and prohibits assistance if the site has 75 decibels or higher outdoor noise. Actually, I'm sorry, it doesn't prohibit assistance, prohibits outdoor noise sensitive uses. So if you're looking at this and saying, well, how do I determine what the decibel level is? HUD has some great guidance on noise studies, how to conduct them on its website, and that website is given here. Okay, next slide, please. Airport clear zones. This is also a pretty cut and dry requirement, applies to new and existing, and prohibits activities and projects within clear zones, accident potential zones, or runway protection zones. And the way you would find out if that applies to your project is by looking for maps of these zones on the internet, basically. I included a link here to one such map, and you would basically plot where your project is in relation to those zones from those maps. If you look at the bottom link under resources, that's going to include some information about where to find those kinds of maps, but they're published locally. Okay. Coastal zone management is the fifth tenet. This also applies to new and existing projects. And essentially what would need to be done with this is to look and make sure that if you are in an area that has a coastal zone, that it complies with the state's coastal zone management plan. So in some cases that may be documenting that you are not in a state that has a coastal zone. Some cases that may be documenting that you have gotten a determination of consistency from the state agency. And if you look, we've got another link here on resources to further explain coastal zone management from HUD's website. Okay. The sixth tenet is floodplains. This one has a little more meat to it than some of the others, so we'll go through this a little more slowly. So the floodplain requirements apply to new and existing, but the requirements differ on depending on whether it's new or existing. So if we are looking at a new construction project, those are actually prohibited if the project is in the 500, 100-year floodplain or in the floodway. And what you would be looking at to make that determination is the best available FEMA data. If you're not familiar with the term best available, essentially that means what that means is the latest maps. That may be an advisory map, it may be a preliminary map, or it may be a final firm map from FEMA. There's not a lot of advisory or preliminary maps out there, but there are some parts of the country where FEMA is updating their maps, so you would want to check and make sure whether that applies to you. Okay, next slide, please. For existing, the only outright prohibitions on existing projects would be in coastal high hazard areas, which are V zones on the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, or regulatory floodways. If the site is in a 500-year or 100-year floodplain, they do have to follow a few requirements. One is that they must either be elevated or flood-proofed. They must have an early warning system and evacuation plan to make sure that people can get out of there in the event of a flood. Next slide, please. They must have flood insurance under the National Flood Insurance Program. And finally, in accordance with that, if this is a community that has been suspended from the National Flood Insurance Program, then they would not be eligible. Okay. And once again, we have a link to more guidance from HUD's website. All right, the seventh tenet, wetlands. This is another one where there are differing new and existing, or differing requirements depending on whether the site is new construction or is existing. So if this is a new construction site, we're not going to allow assistance if it's in a wetland. So those different words there are just explaining what would be considered new construction, kinds of activities that could go along with that. If it's existing and you've got some rehabilitation plan, what you would need to check for is whether any of that rehabilitation will expand the footprint of the site into wetlands. So you might be saying, well, how do we know if there's a wetland or not at our site? What you're going to look to is the definition that's put forth in the document that's cited here. Generally, what the determination of whether there's a wetland turns on are issues such as saturation with water, hydric soils, certain plants and animals. So there's a link to that document on this slide. And one thing I want to note is that if you've got a 404 permit determination that there are no wetlands on the site, that does not mean there's not a wetland on the site. That sounds confusing, but the Army Corps uses a different definition of what a permit means for the 404, or I'm sorry, a different definition of what a wetland means for the 404 permit program than what HUD or other agencies would use to comply with the Wetlands Executive Order. So for purposes of the PRA program, which we're trying to line up with our usual requirements, we're relying on the usual definition of wetland that we would use. So it's essentially a difference between the Clean Water Act wetland definition and an executive order, it's Executive Order 11988 definition of wetland. So just a little background in case you're wondering. And if you're looking for this link on the definition of wetlands or other resources that HUD has on wetlands, you could go to that link that's at the bottom of this slide. Okay. The eighth tenet, explosive flammable hazards. So this would apply only to new construction. You're going to want to take a look and see if such a facility is located near the project that you're considering. If so, that project needs to be protected from blast and thermal radiation. So you would look to see if there's something nearby, whether it's been shielded. Next slide, please. If your project is not shielded from those types of facilities, there's some analysis that's going to need to be done. The figures are given here, but they would be to determine blast overpressure and thermal radiation. If you find out that this nearby facility, first is unshielded and second does not meet these standards, then some shielding would need to be put in place or it would not be acceptable. So some further information on making those types of determinations and doing that kind of analysis is available at that link on the slide, which is to the HUD website. All right, next slide, please. So the ninth tenet is endangered species. This also only applies to new construction. And the project essentially would not be permitted if it results in a taking of species. The tenet gives a bit of an explanation of what's considered to be a taking. Taking includes not only a direct harm to a species, but also modification of their habitat and kind of all the different types of ways you can bother that species that are in between those two things. Maps for determining whether a listed species may be nearby can be found at the link that's given. And also that link and other information are available on the HUD website at that site that's at the bottom of this slide. Okay, next slide. The 10th tenet, farmland protection. Another one that applies only to new construction. New construction cannot result in the conversion of prime farmland to urban uses. So what you would need to do is, if you've got a new construction site, figure out whether the sites you're looking at could qualify as that kind of farmland, and you can do that through the NRCS, National Resource Conservation Service. That link to contact them is given here, but there's also more information available on HUD's website, and that link is also on this slide. Okay. And then the last tenant, number 11, sole source aquifers. Another new construction-only requirement, and essentially what you would need to do is if you're in an area that is protected as or designated as a sole source aquifer, you would need to consult with the EPA on that situation. So there's 78 federally designated sole source aquifers. The link that we gave here will let you know if you are in one of those areas, and more information is available on HUD's website that you can check out. Okay, next slide. This is not given a number because we wanted to highlight that this is actually required regardless of whether we're working under Part 50 or Part 58 review. It's the Coastal Barrier Resource Act, and essentially any activity, whether it's new or existing or whatever's going on, cannot be assisted by the federal government if it's in a Coastal Barrier Resource System unit. So you would need to go onto this website that's given here, make sure your site is not within a mapped CBRS unit, and document that for your file. All right. In here, I wanted to just highlight some of the HUD resources that you may find helpful. So a lot of these links lead you to the HUD Exchange Environmental Review website. It's extremely useful. And so I kind of put a link to it for each individual subject on each slide, because I really think that it can be helpful to all of you when determining, how to document that these tenets have been met. So, for example, on this slide, we've got a link that will take you to sample documents and step-by-step guidance for each individual authority. The second bullet here is to the HUD Form 4128. That's actually not on the HUD Exchange website, but if you're looking for ideas on how to document guidance, it may be helpful to you. There are also sample formats for the Part 58 programs, and like we've mentioned a million times, this isn't a Part 58 program, but you may find the sample formats helpful to you, so wanted to provide that here. And helpful tip, if you go to this link, it actually doesn't bring you right to those formats, but if you look at the right side of the page, that's where you can find those links. So that's the easiest way to get to the Part 58 sample formats. Apologize if there's any confusion, but just look to the right of the page. And then finally, HUD has excellent human resources for environmental questions. We have environmental staff. They're posted throughout the country, and we have subject matter experts here in headquarters. This program is a little strange since it's not under Part 50 or Part 58, but they are helpful for helping you find the websites you need or that kind of stuff to get your documentation in order and demonstrate you've met the tenets. Okay, now that's all of our slides. What kind of questions do we have out there?
We have some great questions. I want to start with one of the listeners asked, when you say, quote, end quote, grantees are required to conduct, end quote, do you mean that we're responsible for having them conducted, whether we conduct them ourselves or contract them out?
Yes, that is what I mean. So what we're looking for is a record that a review was done in which the grantees made sure to happen. If you contract somebody out to perform that for you, that would be fully within what's being contemplated by these tenants. Yep. What I wanted to make sure that you all understood was that it wasn't going to ultimately be evaluated by a responsible entity or by HUD.
second question. Is an environmental review required for any property participating in the program, whether the property will have 20 units or even only 1 unit?
Yeah, the number of units doesn't matter. There's an exception that we discussed at the beginning of the webinar that has to do with whether the site is currently HUD assisted and whether there are physical impacts or activities taking place. But the number of units would not fall into that or be considered, I guess I would say, for that exception.
Okay, thank you. Following along that, for existing properties which may have had their environmental review quite a while ago, such as 16 years, is that too old? Assuming that the apartments are the same, it's been a continuing use that whole time, and there were no other land uses or impacts since then?
Unless you fall within the exception, then yes, I would say it would be too old, because I don't see it being able to meet the phase 1 exception either. So let me explain what I mean by that. There's that general exception that we talked about, that the site is already HUD assisted and there's no physical activities going on. So if it falls within that exception, then it wouldn't have to comply with any of the tenants. There is a kind of separate exception is probably not a good word, but requirement or whatever you want to say for phase 1 ESA specifically, which is site contamination analysis, and that has to do with whether a previous phase 1 ESA had been prepared. However, that only applies if that phase 1 ESA at least met the 2005 version of the standard, and if the site was built 16 years ago, there's no way they could meet that.
So you probably can't, or maybe you can if you thought about it, you think about a specific time period, that would be okay, but more recently done phase 1s would fit. And it's a question of how far back they're still going to meet all the requirements. I was talking to a state today that says probably we'd meet the requirements. A lot of our units would meet the requirements, but need to do the vapor screen.
Yes, I could see that coming up. Yep.
Okay, new question. What if a land use is developed 5 years after you set up your 811 program and it generates over 75 decibels of noise? Will HUD accept the new impact? What happens in that kind of a situation?
So it sounds like what they're saying is they've got an existing project, and after the fact, a noise issue has come up.
Yes.
If the site is existing, they actually wouldn't have to worry about the noise standards that are put forth in the tenants, because those only apply to new construction.
Okay.
So I think that answers that question.
Yes. Okay. On the slide outlining historic preservation, under the first bullet, you state, quote, potential for impact depends on the activity, quote. Are there any activities that are exempt? For example, rental assistance only, no construction, no rehab.
So if you've got a site where nothing's really going on, then you would explain that within your documentation. So yeah, I think that's the only way to answer that. If there's no way that it could impact a historic site because nothing's going on, then you would note that in the file. That's what I meant by putting potential for impact depends on activity.
Okay, great. How do floodplain requirements apply if a site is within the 100-year or 500-year floodplain but protected by a levee?
So they just apply. I mean, the levee doesn't factor in. If it's within the 500 or 100-year floodplain, that's what you would be looking at.
Okay. In the 9th tenet, many areas are being developed in areas that don't have major habitats. but are impacting wildlife corridors and minor temporary habitats. Does number 9 apply to them?
So are they, okay, sounds like what they're saying is there are projects that may be in areas where there are habitats for an endangered species, and if that's the case, then you would need to think about the requirement, but keep in mind that it only applies to new construction.
Great.
So I guess what they're trying to say is maybe this isn't considered there's some sort of difference between major and minor habitats for the species, but that's not, there's no differentiation on that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. One of the listeners asked whether you could reiterate whether a Section 106 consultation, this is around historic preservation, whether a Section 106 consultation is required, or if you only need to determine whether your site is on or eligible for the historic register.
What you're going to be looking at is compliance with any state or local requirements on historic preservation, and then compliance with that second point, which is making sure you meet the interior standards for rehabilitation if the site is listed or eligible for the National Register. So there will be no Section 106 consultation.
Okay, thank you. Would you feel comfortable touching on lead-based paint requirement? Is that something you feel like you could speak to?
Well, actually, we have a whole lead office here at HUD that handles questions on lead-based paint. And I'm not super sure how that was put forth for this program in the NOFA.
Okay. We'll save that for...
That's a fair question. I just didn't prepare for it.
Yep, no problem. We'll save it for the grantee call, listeners, and try to bring something up then for discussion. New question. For new construction, can we close on land prior to completing these tenants?
So I think what they're asking is whether they can acquire the land before they comply.
Whether they can, in this program there's, we didn't talk about this, Hillary, actually, there's something, we talked about the rental assistance contract, the contract that gets signed when the units are ready to be occupied, but states can also sign an ARAC and anticipating signing a RAC. So they may make a commitment of resources to a project that is going to be new construction, but at an early stage, because they're trying to get in on the deal. So,
yeah, that's a great question. Normally, we would not allow any kind of like site commitments or activities prior to putting together an environmental review. But I think this deserves us kind of thinking about a little bit more because of the unique non-applicability of Part 50 and 58 to this program. Why don't we get back to you on that question?
Okay, great. We've got some more. Are choice limiting actions applicable to this program?
That's the same question. So let's get back to you. I think what we're contemplating, what I would contemplate is that the answer is yes. You need to not take choice limiting actions prior to a review being done, but I just want to make sure that that's true.
Okay. We will set that one as those two aside. If a site is new construction and noise mitigation is planned as part of the construction activity, is this okay for PRA to fund?
Well, yeah. I mean, so the noise requirements apply to new construction. What you would need to do is document in the file, that noise is an issue and how you're attenuating it. And yeah, that would be done as part of the new construction activities.
Okay. So this is a follow-up on the 106 question. You indicated that 106 consultation is not required. However, how would a determination of whether a property is potentially eligible for listing on the National Register occur if it isn't evaluated? For example, what if a new construction site contains significant archaeological resources that would be eligible to be listed on the National Register if it was investigated and evaluated under 106?
Yeah, I mean, so there's what we're contemplating here is that there would be state requirements or local requirements on that kind of issue, but since the agency HUD is not involved at that site-specific point, we're not going to be available to run that consultation. We wouldn't be involved, so there would be no consultation process. So you would need to follow, like I said, state-specific requirements on that.
Okay. Those are all our written questions. Stacy, maybe you could do our last slide while we see if any additional questions come in. And if not, we'll hand it back.
Sure thing. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Hillary. So this last slide talks about a new environmental focus group that HUD wants to establish and put together. So this is going to be allow for some informal discussion between grantees, including fiscal year 12 and fiscal year 13. It's going to help you guys talk to each other about these issues and also help HUD identify some FAQs. So if you're interested in being a part of this focus group, you should email Myra Pavin, and her email address is shown on this slide, mpavin@tacinc.org, and we'll get a mailing list together and start scheduling the first focus group. Lisa, any other questions come in that sort of brief time?
Nope. That's it. So I guess the focus group would be a place to come back with some of the couple of questions that Hillary will come back with answers to.
Can I just butt in for a second, Lisa? This is Hillary.
Sure.
I just wanted to, realizing that I may not have answered half of that last question on historic preservation, which I think was about how would you determine if it's eligible for the National Register. There is guidance on what is considered to be eligible available on the interwebs, including that resource link that we gave at the bottom of the historic preservation slide. So apologies for not catching that portion of the question earlier.
Oh, thanks for paying such close attention. Appreciate it. So if this is something you want to work on more, have additional questions, email, as Stacy said, and we can do follow-ups to that. I hand it back to Marvis and Katina.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to thank Hillary for the presentation. We realize that's kind of a lengthy one, but it's very important and it's very critical to your implementation of your projects. So we thank also everyone for tuning in today, and we look forward to talking to you soon. And just as a reminder, we have our convening coming up in October, and so we look forward to seeing everyone there. And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you.